All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. We're so excited to be having this workshop this evening, how to do a budget for your film. And we're so happy to welcome Mattias Graham and Janine Windolph. We have Mattias, who is a settler filmmaker from Regina, Saskatchewan on Treaty 4, and is based in Montreal, Quebec. He has a BFA with a specialization in film production from Concordia, and his work focuses on prairie stories, power dynamics, and masculinity. He also works as an editor, helping others tell their stories. He is a longtime member of the Saskatchewan Film Pool Co-op. And we have also Janine Windolph, who is a Saskatchewan-based filmmaker, interdisciplinary artist, curator, and storyteller. Windolph works for the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity as the Associate Director of Indigenous Arts. So without further ado, thank you so much for bringing us this workshop tonight. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, did you want to say any other introductory remarks before we move on to the presentation part? Anything you think can share about your love of budgets? Right. You want me to start? Just kidding.
Are you asking me, Janine?
I was just saying, did you want to frame like a little bit more introductory in terms of like how you got into budgeting or any kind of backstory before we move into logistical?
Yes, you mean like to continue introducing ourselves?
Yeah, just framing around the workshop.
Yeah, well, Janine, you correct me if I misrepresent us, but when we were approached to start this, we realized it could go a lot of different ways. And the fundamentals we wanted to impart today is that the budget is not separate. It is an essential part of production. And so we hope that by the end of this, if there's ever any doubt, that people will be looking at the budget as a creative tool and not as a chore or an obstacle, even though it might feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, and then because Matty and us, sorry, I had a Zoom all day. I just had another event before this. But when we first met to talk about it, we were actually talking about it in terms of like what we can talk about. So we knew that there's different softwares. So we're not really wanting to cover typical software, though we can touch upon things. We thought if we go kind of more of process and methodology and then take the time at the beginning to kind of set up our conversations, and then we can move into the different types of budgeting templates and tools that we're going to give to you and resources that you can look at, different ideas. I actually pulled up 2 budgets that I have from previous productions that I can also share later on to help kind of show a different format. But for me, I really love working with budgets, no matter what my background is. I've always either produced art projects, produced films, and at the Banff Center, that's my main role, is creating a budget, implementing the budget, and then final reporting on the budget, which all ties in with different creative projects. So we felt the more of kind of exploring each of those would be a great way to start and aligning it with film in particular. And then we thought after we're done the presentation part, because you do have 2 resources here who are willing to chat through any projects that you may have, that if you had any specific questions that we could help with or point the way, we would like to use the latter half where we don't want to record if there's personal kind of questions, just because we know that if there's something you're sharing and developing and it's not out there yet, we probably don't want to share that on a YouTube link. So that's partly why we thought we'll kind of go through it, and then we'll tailor the last part of our presentation as more of a Q&A. And so we also wanted to get to know who's in the room. So we wanted to have introductions from who's here, and you can turn your camera on, you can don't have to, you can have your audio on, but we thought we'd just do a little roundtable of who's in the room and what you're interested in learning in terms of budgeting for this session. So if we want to start with, well, Esperanza, you're first on my screen here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is really important for us because we really need your knowledge. In my case, I am in a particular moment as a student that I need to produce short films, and all the time the budget is an issue. And I try to learn as much as I can. How can I use resources, library, friends, YouTube videos, learning from my own, and the studio from the university, but it still is too much things to learn. And this is why I am here. I am really ready to learn from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Esperanza. Juan, you're next on my line of participants here.
Oh. Oh.
Okay, I think we
Did we lose them?
Lost one, maybe.
okay. Well,
It's a tough question. Oh,
Back maybe.
Oh, sorry. Wait, can you hear me?
yes, welcome back.
Hi, my Wi-Fi kind of cut off. So I'm a student filmmaker, and I mean, I just graduated from film school, and I've been wanting to learn more of the producing part. I studied filmmaking in general, but I've been wanting to learn about producing and budgeting and all that. So that's why I'm here. Yeah.
Thank you. And Luis, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, Luis. Hi, I am actually I'm a filmmaker. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I mostly direct, but I am also part of a film collective called Bahia Colectiva, and we are just, well, I mean, we're all sort of collaborating on each other's projects, and one of the things we do is sort of produce for each other. And one of the main sort of issues that we have sometimes is how to properly budget for our project. So yeah, thank you for doing this. This is really great. And I feel like yeah, we just encountered that there is a lot of sort of like reluctancy to sort of like unveil the process behind making a budget, or people are sometimes don't love sharing their budgets. And so yeah, thank you for this generous space.
Awesome. We have we're going to break down a few of the differences in doc and fiction at the end. So just a heads up, we're going to try to keep everything as general as possible, but there are, of course, as you know, some differences in how the two are produced.
And Produ 000.
Is that wrong? All right. That's our benefactor.
Okay.
Well, I'll handle the introductions in person here. We have two guests.
My name is Ekaterini, and I'm a filmmaker too. And I want to learn about budgeting because I have a film in my head that I want to make it feature film.
Okay.
Many short films. And at this point, I thought it's good to do many short films and then connect them all together.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to learn the budgeting.
Great. And it's Caterini?
Yeah, my name is Ekaterini.
So there's Caterini's here, and she's interested in learning how to budget larger projects or longer term projects. And also,
my name's Tori. I think maybe just budgeting is just maybe an aspect a lot of people maybe overlook, but it's just something to me that's just like very extremely interesting. And as you mentioned, like using it as a creative tool and using it to your advantage, it's maybe just this workshop is a very valuable resource for myself.
Okay, great. And so Tori?
Yeah,
Great. All right. So Tori says he's just really interested in budgeting. So you're in the right place.
Yeah. Especially particularly with that.
Yeah. If there are any specific questions when that come up, we'll have lots of time at the end as well. Okay, great. And that's everyone here.
Yeah, so for scoping, this is one of the most important parts of a budget. And so everybody thinks there's this master template that you can just copy and have it for your project. The reality is that you could maybe use the template of an Excel or any sort of software, but the reality is scoping is unique to each project. So I actually get really excited about the conversations as a producer and as a director. I feel like that's where a lot of the understanding of how big your budget is going to be, how you're going to look for funding. So this step for me is one of the most important, and actually I find it really exciting, but that's also just me. So usually when people ask when it comes to budgeting, I usually like to start off with a coffee, and then I just take a lot of notes, and that really helps me understand where the filmmaker's going, how many locations, what their goals are. And so we wanted to really start off with this and highlighting it as a creative tool, because it's something that you'll keep going back to. And I don't like to think of it as this secret budget. I was telling Mattias, I think that isn't necessary. I like transparency. So if you can use that to talk with your crew in particular, you can really help get a better sense of what your budget really needs to be. And so Mattias, you want to share a little bit more about on this slide?
Yeah. So just to clarify what we mean by scoping too, it's that question of how big is this going to be? What do I need to tell this story? What can I do without? It's at this stage where you really see what the fundamentals of a budget are, which are priorities, right? And as we'll get into the details, the priorities are different for each project, like Janine mentions. They're different for different budget levels. The concerns for a no budget film you're doing with your friends are going to be different from a fully unionized $1 million production. But the process of scoping and breaking down the project from the script or from initial plans, proposals is a similar process for each project.
Yeah, so part of what we wanted to highlight was to have a really effective budget. It's really important to collaborate between who's doing the directing and yourself as a producer. Sometimes we take on both roles, so it's good to have someone you can also feed your conversations to help pull out some of those tools. So it might have an associate producer help you, but I know from experience doing both, you can often lose aspects of your budget by not seeing holistically. So having someone work with you in terms of breaking down what your story is, even when you're going to shoot, who needs to be involved, and your roles really help start to inform who your budget is, who's impacted in your budget and what you'll need to be successful for each project. So I would say no project in particular can look exactly the same, but there's definitely fundamentals that you can explore and see what's relevant in terms of your actors, who your main crew is. And so those conversations are important, and your rates will shift depending on the nature of your project. But we really wanted to highlight that this is not something you just create and submit, that this is something you should be looking at through each level. So development, production, and even in post-production, because that's often where people overspend in production and then they don't have enough for the post-production. And then distribution often gets put last. on budget priorities, and same with development. But those are the two key areas that are important not to overlook. And so, Mattias, you want to share?
Yeah, just to add to what Janine is saying, is like the key thing here is early ongoing discussions between the key people leading the project. It's the same process if it's yourself doing both, right? If you're producing your own work, all the stuff we're talking about will be helpful. But if you're producing other people's work, which can be a little bit overwhelming, keeping this in mind, like your job is to support the story, to support the work conditions, and make the best creative environment possible for the film. And to do that, you just have to find out what's actually important, because not everything might be evident on the page, right? Like you might have a director who approaches things in a way where they need to have this one location, right? Like it's critical to the project that you have access to this one location that only exists one place in the world. Well, obviously that needs to take a higher priority in the budget. I think where sometimes people get into problems is when there's a disconnect between the creative and logistical sides of the production. And that's where some of those horror stories end up, where you're like, wait, no, this is the most important thing. Why did we budget for all of this? And now we can't do this thing that will actually make or break the movie. So there's no secret sauce to it. You just got to talk about it.
Secret sauce.
Yeah.
And so that's, adding to really put a pin in that, like it's sorting out, those early discussions help you determine what the priorities are well before you put pen to paper or any numbers in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and some of those priorities can even be if you wanted a key actor in there, and if that person is so important to carry the film, you're going to be negotiating what your rates are. If they're part of ACTRA, then you're definitely going to be looking at some different rates versus if they're more non-acting and would accept a lower rate, sometimes like the entrance to that. And then also who you're getting to direct. Sometimes you're working from a producing lens and you want to have someone who you know would help with your film. Sometimes you're also giving them a little bit more of a fee if there's someone who's recognized. But at the same time, I find producers tend to not budget for themselves, which I was saying you should always budget for yourself in there so that you can also survive, so you're not getting another job at the meantime. So part of it is like looking at how can you survive and who do you need, and then working from there. And then sometimes you both go in with a good heart and you both want to be able to, we'll just figure it out as you go along. But, I always like to say it's good to have a partnership agreement and to know how you're going to work together. And then if you need someone to come in as a third party, it really is looking at your outlining what's most important. So that should happen right away in your budgeting process, especially if it's going to implicate the rest of what your budget will look like. So there's, I would say, necessary sacrifices that you'll have to make along the journey. But as long as you're really focused on what is central to your story, that's the most important part, I would say, of making sure you're always revisiting and going back to, am I actually meeting my priorities? And so we just wanted to make sure we really outline that, because sometimes we don't communicate those to our team and even to ourselves. We kind of think everything's important, especially when you're starting out, everything's important. And so you don't want to catch yourself in terms of negotiating later, unless you have some creative revelation where you want to switch your budget up to welcome a new vision. But most of the time I say do that right away, because that gets the spirit of what your project will look like. So they're kind of hand in hand, each of these conversations that you would start.
So what does that look like on a more granular level? Like if we were to make a to-do list, the first thing to do after those conversations or even before is to understand the script, understand the proposal, and determine where trouble issues may be, This is something that gets easier the more you do it. But yeah, it's kind of obvious, but sometimes people skip it or ask people to make a budget for them without the person knowing what the script is. How can you do that, right? Like you're just putting words on a page. So that's always the first thing.
Yeah. And then also getting to know the nature of the story. So usually, like if I do a creative read of someone's script, I'm not thinking budget just yet. I'm thinking, am I going to commit to this story? But usually a second read, and then you start highlighting what are props, what are costumes, how many actors, how many extras. So you really start to pull out details when you look through the script, I would say the second time. And that's the same with a documentary proposal, because sometimes the scope, like I'm going to go and I'm going to live on a trap line for 2 weeks. Obviously, I'll need to get there. I'll need a bush plane. I'll need boats. I'll need a guide. I'll need safety gear. So you really have to like really open up how you're looking at each of these elements, and you just jot everything down. Doesn't matter if it's important or not. I do a brainstorm of everything that I'm pulling out of either the script or the proposal. And then those are things that you can have to guide your next level of a conversation, because then you either start figuring out, well, is it really important that we have a drone show us coming on a plane? Or is it more important we're on the ground and someone's shooting up, so we only need the one camera? Equipment, like some people overlook the equipment part, but sometimes when you're transferring equipment to different locations and depending on the scope of your project, equipment, even just in the transportation, can be important. So do you need all your cameras if you're going out in the wilderness, or can you settle for smaller light packs? So those kind of conversations are important, especially if you want to shoot higher end film versus a low key. Like some people are out there using their phone nowadays, it's got better quality than they used to have. So you look at the level of what do you want visually also to look like. But then where we say what you need solutions for, sometimes those solutions could be in-kind contributions. You might have someone, but you still want to note them in your budget and give it a value. So that way their contribution is reflected in your budget. So if you don't do that, I think the danger for what can happen later in future budgets is you don't think about them if you are always assuming you're going to get stuff for free. But if you note them in there, you can always go back and then start pulling what those actually would have cost and what you would have needed for your full budget. Or you might want to talk about, well, we don't need this scene. It's going to cost way too much. I've done that in film conversations, is do we really need to reenact, for example, one of the films, they wanted to reenact the whole TRC experience and have hundreds of people at effing Univ, and told my late friend and director, you can do that, but that's all of your budget. And so what is the importance was actually the relationship between herself, the subject, and the health support worker. And so it ended up being just 3 people in an intimate setting. So when you have those conversations, you can start to weigh where your priorities are. So it always goes back to your priorities. And then at the end of the day, and this is something Mattias brought up, is do you need more funding? So if your scale gets bigger, then you should start looking at additional funds. Or at least that's how I interpreted it, right?
Yeah, well, that's it. That's what's great about establishing this relationship early on between the producer and the director, is you can find creative solutions. It's a lot cheaper to change something on the page than once you're on set, right? But what happens when you realize, like, actually, this is fundamental. This is the movie, you know, or this is the documentary. We need to do this. We don't have the money for it. Well, now you know, and you can start looking for other solutions and other funders. And I think where a lot of especially like first time micro budget projects end up in deep water is not looking far enough ahead with that, and then projects get stalled and you have to try to get the funds afterwards, and it's just it's not very helpful for a creative process most of the time. So the earlier you can flag something like that and change course, whether it's to more funding or a smaller project, I'd argue the stronger the result will be, and certainly it'll be a more pleasant process along the way.
Yeah, and where that goes is also we put choosing a funder. So each of the funding bodies that you can go to look different depending on whether it's the Sask Arts Board Independent Grant or a Canada Council grant. It's more artist driven versus if you're going to Telefilm or Creative Saskatchewan, that reflects more industry. So you also take a look at what type of project do you want to do and what makes most sense. So for a lot of the independent grants that I've ever accessed, it's usually a smaller crew, and it's more about developing your methodology, your techniques, and expanding your vision as an artist. And so those grants are really good for experimentation within your filmmaking process. With Telefilm, you really have to roadmap exactly what you're going to do, and they're going to look at your plan and they're going to look at your budget to make sure your plan reflects what you can do. So if you're not budgeting, say, for that drone shot, and then you highlight it all over your project that you're going to have drone this and drone that in your script, they're going to look at that gap, and chances are they'll flag things in the jury process. So you want to make sure that your narrative really reflects what you're doing. But then something to think about too is who's going to own the project after. So there's different ways you can get into a project. With the artistic grants, you definitely own it as an independent artist. If you go through Telefilm, they usually get you to incorporate, or even Creative Saskatchewan as well. But those ones you would put it in it could be a partnership, but it has to be an incorporated body as well. It could be a one-time company, or it can be a company that you'll keep going back to and getting funding. So looking at how you want to do that will implicate who owns it. But then at the same time, there's the NFB where you can also do co-productions, but then you're sharing the rights over the film. So some people don't like sharing distribution rights. Personally, the only reason I love working with the NFB and allowing them to help me support some of my films is because I'm actually not great at distribution. It's not my gift. So they do the distribution for me. So I've done all different scopes of projects, independent. I've done incorporated bodies through Telefilm on a feature film, but I also worked with the NFB where they own my work. And so what I always say is, it depends on the story that you're bringing forward. So if it's something really personal that I want to have agency to where it's shared, then I might choose the independent artist road, because then I have more power over how and where it's being shared, versus where you don't have that same power. Like, so the NFB, sometimes I find my films just screened and it's on a Facebook post, and to me that's great. But depending on what your project is, you want to consider where you take your story after. And then actually, we were also saying that because each of them is going to give you their own template that they want to see your budget on. So you can create a wonderful budget, but they'll still make you transfer it into their budget so they can compare and look at each of the projects in that lens. But those would be the main points I would have on this slide.
Yeah, since we have a documentarian here, I need to add as well, broadcasters are, of course, another important option, and these are all really different paths. So the question Janine's highlighting about whether the scope of the project is necessary to make the trade-off with working with the broadcaster, or is it too specific, and is it something you need to do on your own? It's going to open up a path that is unique to your project. You, at a certain point, may need to tailor your project more in the way the budget is constructed for a funder, but you should always let the nature of the project itself speak to find the funder, and not the other way around. Yeah, which leads us to producing itself, which we kind of separated between director and producer before for good reason, because they really are different jobs, though both are vital to the filmmaking process. So What exactly is a producer and what does a producer do? Janine, can you answer this? Because no one really told me in film school.
It looks different depending on each production. So usually depending on the nature of and the scale, like I found if you have a big producing team, then some of the duties get split out. So when you can have a program manager or a production manager who's focused on the implementation, that leaves you to looking towards funding. So usually an executive producer can be someone who's bringing something to the table, but is not as actively engaged in the day-to-day producing activities. So that would be like contracting, negotiating with funders, even just those distribution deals that are mentioned. But sometimes you can be right down into the nitty gritty. You can be doing your bookkeeping, which to me, I like to do the bookkeeping. So I like entering things because then that also helps with those creative conversations. So if I know I overspent in one area, then I can talk to the director and start to negotiate where we can transfer money from, because, well, at the end of the day, you're only going to have what cash flow you have in your account. And so keeping track of that along the way is important. If you have a bigger production, then you can definitely have someone hired to do your bookkeeping and accounting and then reporting that back up. And so sometimes that's even like, depending on the smaller productions, sometimes that's even negotiating your locations. And so part of what I would say is one of the main things is you're also implicated in a financial way to the production. And so if you do go over budget, it's usually the producer who ends up being responsible. There's this idea that as the producer, you're going to become rich. And I hope we all one day can benefit in that way. But the reality is, you know, a lot of the stuff that if you're really strong at your distribution part, you can definitely make your money back and you can definitely make money from it. But at the same time, I see it as more like you're financially responsible for the production and that relationship with the director. And so I wouldn't say there is one way a producer looks. Sometimes I've been an associate producer in terms of like just helping people navigate community. So sometimes that's just networking people to the right, especially if it's not a community that people are, when you're bringing in people. So it's setting them up with who are the local camera people, who can you get for craft services. So there's logistical ways. And then sometimes people are just bringing the distribution. Like sometimes people will come in and I'm producing, but once your film's made, I'm going to take that out. But then in most cases, smaller productions, I would say you're doing all of that. And so the bigger your production is, you definitely get a little bit, I wouldn't say the work's easier. I don't want to create that myth that either way, there's a lot of work to producing. But definitely what you put here in terms of like the conflict management, you know, that becomes an integral part of it. But also like paying people out, making sure they're getting their weekly pay, especially if you're doing a feature film, you'd want to pay them out each week. And so there's those logistical stuff, but really you're the overarching kind of relationship to the whole production, while the director is really intimate in the story and with your crew and actors. So that's how I would kind of describe the degrees of producing.
I like that. It's I wish I could attribute this because I don't remember who said this, but a few years ago, someone introduced what producing was, because like you're saying, it totally looks different depending on the project. But they described it very generally that producing is the job of ensuring the best possible creative environment for a film. And that includes hiring, that includes making sure people get paid, that includes making sure you have the people involved to handle all aspects of the production, and making sure the director has the tools and support they need to tell the story. The producer is there before the script in many cases, is before the director in many cases, and like Janine is saying, will be financially liable for the project far long after. So for any of our self-producing folks in here and independent filmmakers, I find that's a helpful way to look at it, is that if you're producing your own work, you're trying to set yourself up to have the best possible conditions to create this particular work. And I skipped the most important part, and that includes managing the budget. This is really vital. But the producer isn't the only person who's connected to the budget, right? There's many aspects of production that need to be managing money as well. Some of the ways that can look is a production manager, right, or unit managers on larger sets will have to be working with the producer to coordinate the budget as it goes on. Sometimes executive producers take on a support role in that case too, right, and kind of taking off some of the day-to-day responsibilities for the producer, as well as bookkeepers, production accountants. There is the larger the production, there's going to be a whole team to make this happen as well, because the scale can increase really, really fast. And if you're self-producing or producing your friends' projects, you're basically doing all that. So good job. That's why it feels hard.
Yeah, there's also an aspect so a lot of the times when you do get certain funding, I had one funding body for my feature that would only give us the check when you submitted your first day of shooting. And so in the meantime, there's this line of credit that you need to have established. And so if you have development money, that's why I say always go for development. Some people overlook development and put it in production, but you still need to book your hotels. You still need to pay for people's transportation. Sometimes you need to pay for flights. So a lot of that ends up falling to the producer, which I try and minimize any producer taking anything out of their personal pockets, but it does happen. And so I know building your line of credit wasn't something that was easy. I couldn't do that as a single mom who was also just got out of being a student, because I also went to the U of R film program and then I did my master's. So when I came out as a self-employed artist, there wasn't much opportunity for me to start building that up. And so there's a fundraising component as well that's ends up happening. So there's Indiegogo. You can definitely raise some of that money prior, but the responsibility to have a cash flow for each of those steps is super important, because you need to make decisions in terms of where you want, like how much money do you have in your bank? Because you can say, I got a micro budget grant that's $250,000, but you're not going to get that $250,000 in a check cut and put into your bank account. Often they're also asking you to find other funders. So there's that grant writing component that is super important. And so depending on the scale and where you're going, you can definitely be pretty busy behind the scenes. So for a larger one, I try to do the co-producing, co-directing. And for myself, I learned that that's two different hats to wear. There's a creative hat, and then there's the logistical hat. And so some of those conflicts of conversation comes when you either can't afford to do something, or you want to take the plunge and get this amazing shot, knowing that you're going to have to make a conversation elsewhere. But as the producer, you have to make sure you have that money in your account, or you're mediating when you're going to pay that out. So there's all these behind the scenes conversations that you're going to be having with businesses, with your funder, with your director, your crew, that need to be ongoing. So I'm not saying don't. I'm just saying if you do direct and produce, it's going to be challenging on the larger scoping projects. But I also think you got to trust who you're working with. That's why I like to demystify the budgeting process. I actually like to share the budget openly so that those conversations can be a little bit more understood in terms of when you take something from one area, you can actually see it coming or where it's moving to. But I do think that, I think the comment was made here that everybody seems to have this mystical budgeting process. And, you know, I think part of that isn't necessarily that they don't want to share their secrets, but they don't want to share the mistakes they made along the way. So I'm not that person. I'm a professional failure, and that's what makes me successful. Is I definitely learned from each project in terms of how to better anticipate and avoid certain mistakes. And so, yeah, that's the learning on this role.
Well, and that leads us to the day-to-day work of budgeting, right? As the producer, it's one thing to build a budget in advance, but it's something you are going to keep doing every day. It's every day on set, covering conversations with crew, understanding what surprise costs there are, seeing problems before they happen, and yeah, working with people you trust and maintaining all those conversations. That's really fundamental to keeping on budget, or at very least understanding what's happening to the film as it goes on. It's not something that you do at the beginning and then at the end say, oh, wow, that worked or didn't. I mean, you can, I guess, but I think you'll have an easier time if you approach it that way. And that's part of why there are so many different roles involved on larger productions, right? Like bookkeeping is its own job. It's its own job to keep track of receipts and people's expenses and stuff. And when you have a 100-person crew, one person can't do that while also being responsible for the other logistics of the production. That's not the scope we're talking about today, but those responsibilities still need to be dealt with while shooting, during pre-production and in post-production. So
yeah, well, that, and you definitely build in a contingency, especially with the larger projects, but you can't rely that your contingency is going to catch everything. So that day-to-day diligence actually helps you really make sure you're staying afloat, and then that way you're using your contingency as needed, or you're at least anticipating as much as you can so that you're not worried about that catching everything. Because I did one production and the contingency was like gone in one expense. And so then we had no contingency for the rest of the film. So we had to really rely on those negotiations and conflict management along the way. So if you do the day-to-day stuff, then you understand where you're at each day, and that can help your decision-making process.
Yes, and this is especially true on longer projects like a documentary, right? Like you may have wisely budgeted for travel that ended up being way cheaper. Well, now you can plan your next shoots accordingly, or reallocate some things and prioritize it. Like the budget you submit in the beginning to a funder is destined to change. Everyone understands this as soon as you hit the reality of production. And treating it that way is like treating the budget as a living document is really vital, because it will allow you to also find new opportunities as you go along. I can think one example of my most recent film is we needed to film in some pools. Pools are expensive, but we got a really good deal on this one hotel, and so it opened up all these opportunities for amenities at that location that we were a little bit concerned about making, right? But because my producer was on it all the time, we were able to pivot even in the week leading up to the production. Like that's really the beauty of treating it as this day-to-day responsibility.
Yeah, and then to note that you would have your forecasted. You don't ever want to lose sight of what you submitted to your funder. So I always keep that as like a locked column, even though I'm changing it. And then I create a new column, which is my actuals. And part of what that does is it helps me understand what the variance is. So sometimes you can make a decision, like for example, in one of my films, we moved off track and then we didn't bring in enough Saskatchewan crew to support because we needed specialized skills. And in that, we ended up implicating how much money we were going to get back when we submitted our final report, because we didn't have as much money spent on Saskatchewan crew. So if we were tracking even just those little details in the notes, so I have a variance, but I also have notes so that I can go back, and then you can also rationale to your funder that we didn't have those skills here. So sometimes if you can do that, they actually can forgive your oversight, but you have to have a narrative that goes along with it. So when you're tracking and keeping notes in your actual expenses and your before, that gives you that conversation point when you're going back to your funders as to why you made certain decisions along the way. It's harder when you go back, and if you don't look at what you submitted, to go back and then you put them together. Sometimes decisions get lost, or those points get lost along the way, especially when you have a larger crew. So for me, that day-to-day note keeping, I do that even at the BAM Center. Every day, if there's some new change in a contract or a new expense, I actually take the end of each day to sit there and write notes on it, because I also do the final reporting here as well. But I do that on all the productions, not every day on a small production, obviously, but anytime you do some shooting or expenses go out, then you definitely want to do that. But on a feature film, when you're shooting, like say 3 weeks, each of those days, things are going to accumulate. People are going to have receipts to submit every day. So you just want to keep track, because later on, you're going to have to explain why you made decisions. So partly that day-to-day, we wanted to just emphasize, but we don't mean like every day. If it's a small student production or a small budget production, you don't have to sit there every day making notes, but depending on your scale. But you still got to look at it, and don't get anxiety over your budget. I find people stress out about budgets and wondering if you're on track. So there's like an anxiety associated with the budgeting process. But if you demystify it and take ownership over it, for me, budgeting is like super exciting. I think I'm like one of the few people who get excited of having budgeting coffee conversations, because to me, there's a creative aspect and there's an important role in there. But that's not for everybody. But I'm hoping everybody here has some excitement over budgets and producing. Otherwise, you still can learn a lot. But I don't know. I find it exciting.
Is there anyone with any questions so far, like any terms or anything that needs to get clarified? We're still going to go into a few more things, but just want to take a moment, give people the chance. No, we're all good? Okay. Well, let's get into some more general tips. Janine has already mentioned a couple of them, but for everyone who's not aware, contingency is allocating specific funds just in case something happens. And on films, something always happens. So it's really important to allocate a percentage of the budget that grows or shrinks with your budget, that will be there to smooth the bumps that happen along the way. Yeah, Janine, do you have anything to add about contingency? It's like very simple, but it's also just the biggest production nightmares I've seen is when there's no contingency and you're like, I have the perfect budget, and then one thing is like twice the price, and you're like, oh no, I'm in debt. This is my project. I'm talking about my project. So like it's yeah. Is there anything else people should keep in mind?
Well, definitely. Yeah, that's why I do a lot of talking and conversations at the beginning, trying to anticipate as much. And I actually tend to over budget purposely in other areas like travel, things that I think that I don't have hard costs. So if it's a contract, then I know, unless they negotiate higher, that this is generally what I'm going to spend. But those variables, I try and have that other areas over budget, but I also try and make sure that I'm not just I'm not trying to be a lazy producer and just, I'll catch it with a contingency. Because the thing is, it's a contingency, and most grants, some won't let you have a contingency, just so you know. That's why I also over budget. Mostly the independent grants don't want to see a contingency on there. But for telefilm, they're definitely you can have up to 10% of what your whole budget is allocated to your contingency. So it's not meant to be a very large number. It's meant to be kind of strategic and really is what it is supposed to be. But I've seen people who will just take it out of the contingency. But I still think you need to do that larger conversation piece in all your areas instead of just going to that, because your contingency is going to get eaten up pretty fast if that's the mentality there. But yeah, just to know that not all grants are going to want to see that. Our funders are going to want to have it, but those ones that do, build it in.
Yes, well, but I like what you're saying about putting a cushion in the specific budget categories as well, like regardless of whether or not you can, like the funder wants it in. It's just good to have that, because at the end, best case scenario, you have a little bit of money left over, and that frees up other possibilities. Now, those posters that you had kind of said, we'll figure it out later. Well, now you can do it. Or bring in another technician, do something special. Like there's just so many options that show up, like when you deliver a project on budget and there's a extra, you now open up other possibilities for the production that you would have had to say no to. So yeah, can be a motivating thing.
Yeah. And then for post-production, you definitely want to take a look at the scope of your project and decide who you want in there. So some of the things that I've been through is, say I get hired to edit, but then they don't factor in music or sound design or any aspect of graphics. And so if I was well equipped to do them all, that's great, but I'm not a musician and you don't want to hear me sing. So let's just put it that way. But I can definitely do assembly, I can do fine tuning. So I find sometimes we just assume that post-production can happen with one person. You really do need to think of who your team is and the strength that you want, especially if you're going to add in elements of animation. You definitely want, that's a whole other mini budget that you want to factor in there. But then also you want to make sure you're thinking about who's your music, because I actually don't do a lot of very music heavy stuff, but sometimes you do want music in there. So it can be a sound designer you need. But if you're one of the few who like to really have just music in every single scene, it's going to add up eventually. Some people like to rely on musicians to just give them music because it's a good opportunity. I don't like to do that. I think you budget as much as you can. If people are so kind and offer stuff, that's great, especially smaller productions. People just want their stuff out there. But I always say just budget for them, because I find where I always see people wanting to kind of, I guess, I always say my kids can't eat exposure. So I don't like to do that to any other area. But I do think post-production gets overlooked quite a bit. But I always think if you got a great sound designer, they can do such amazing stuff, especially with the graphics, color correction. So you just want to make sure that when you're budgeting, you're thinking of the look and the aesthetic of your film. And then distribution, I had noted that people tend not to think about the distribution as much. You do have to identify in the Indigenous Screen Office, in telefilm, they do want to know where this film is meant to go. So is it a theatrical release? Is it a broadcast release? Is it a community screening? Because there is aspects of community engagement, especially in the Indigenous Screen Office and telefilm. They want to know that that film is going to have a life after. So you really got to plan for your festival fees, travel, because you want to make sure you can get there as well. You want your director to get there. You might want your actors to get there. You might also be negotiating. If the festival brings you in, they might also pay for some of that. So that could offset some costs, but you don't want to assume that people are going to pay for those. So some festivals said, hey, you got in, but you just got to come and travel. So if you don't have that in your budget, you're just going to be pulling it out of your pocket or fundraising, or you might get a travel grant from, say, Canada Council or Sask Arts Board. But I always say just build it into your budget that you will end up traveling to share your film. And then I was building community screenings, because I feel like as a philosophical point, like when I made my film in L'Orange, I made sure that I screened it in L'Orange. And so looking at the nature of your film, you want to make sure you're giving back the story where the story needs to be received. So you can't just take from a community, especially if it's not your own community. You want to make sure your budget reflects that engagement. And they do look at that. I sit on a lot of juries. And so they will, that's one of the scoring points is how engaged are in all aspects, but distribution's one area that they'll look at. And so that's what I have to say about the post-production distribution.
To be more specific with everyone here too, it's not something that is necessarily going to be flagged by a funder if you don't have like festival fees and stuff on there. Like there are separate funds, including the film pool in the past anyway has had a distribution fund. But it is in your interest if you're self-producing to factor this in. Festivals, even $10 ones really add up. And it's not fun to be caught at the very end of everything and realize like you're gonna have to go out of pocket when you could have planned for that. Like we're saying, as a producer, it's ultimately your responsibility, but it's it's something you think about because there are other ways, like Ginny mentioned, working with the NFB, they handle distribution. Now all of a sudden that's a cost that you don't need to factor into your budget. The government of Quebec has funding for distributors that gets factored into production that they finance. Like there's ways to do that. But I just want to highlight that because it's so hard to make a movie, and we focus so much on that we can kind of leave this little sour taste in our mouths at the end when we just don't have any money left over to actually get it seen or introduced to a community. And I think that's just really important.
Yeah, and then it could also impact like how you distribute it. So sometimes some festivals will only want to launch the world premiere. Some won't. If you put it online, they're not going to want to screen it. Not all places, but there's some who are very particular about how you actually launch it. And so if you are relying on, say, broadcasting funds, like say you want CBC and they got first rights, you have to be careful in terms of how you flow it out there. But as you can also, what I like to do is I also like to, when I apply, I focus on development in one grant, I focus on production in one grant, and then I focus on post-production and distribution as a separate grant. If you do that, it also broadens the amount of funding you can bring in for one project, but then you really focus each of your narrative, your application narrative and your budget on certain components, and you can really flesh it out and make a stronger project. With some of the independent artist grants, they do let you do that as well, maybe not in 4, but definitely you want to take that into consideration in terms of which grant you're applying for, because especially the independent artist grant, or if it's a community-driven grant, they're going to be looking for different things. But you do want to think about it. And for the NFB, like what they do for the ones that they produce, that they hire me to create, is they let me identify 5 festivals and then they apply for me. But I always put everything online. I believe all my films should eventually be online because for me, it's important to have it accessible and free. But that's not everybody's philosophy in distribution. Some people are looking for kind of, you can actually make money off of distribution. But I would say if you really want to go down that path, bring someone in who's really strong at that, because it is an art form on its own.
Right. Yeah. There, even shorts, there are sales markets. Like this is a potential path, but it's also one that's hard to predict. So best to plan a little bit for how you're going to handle it personally, just in case that stuff doesn't work out.
Yeah, and definitely plan for it, because I see so many films that make it to shooting that just never get finished. And I'm guilty. I have a few projects that need to get post-production and put out into the world. but it is common where people kind of push really hard and then they get burnt out after production. And then also they use up their funds. So if you separate them, that also gives you an opportunity to apply and rebuild your budget. But you don't want to put everything in one grant, because then you can't always go back to the same grant unless you're revising what your goals are. So you can, but it makes it a little bit, takes an extra step in there. So yeah, I would just keep that in mind. That was kind of where I see a lot of people stop, is in the post-production. And so, and then insurance we put down here, depending on the scale of your production, you may, like, I think insurance is great to have. I know for my feature, we had frontline insurance, and I think that was about $1,500 to budget. But what it does is it gives you security throughout your production. Like, I actually had to go and get a physical to make sure that as a director that I was actually in good health and there was no chance of me getting sick during the production, because there is things that could happen to, like, you could get injured. Something can stop you from not being able to shoot one day. We had a truck that actually was our prop truck that actually got hit while it was being moved from one location to another. So we had to use that in our insurance. It wasn't something you plan. And then we had to shoot it only from one angle after, because it was an old truck. So you couldn't exactly, we couldn't afford a duplicate one. And so insurance is just generally good to have, but I know for some of the smaller productions, it can be more challenging to have factor in a large cost. And, you know, some of the smaller ones, I haven't always had insurance, but generally it's a good rule of thumb. I know Mattias might have some learning in the insurance area.
Yeah, it would be a whole other workshop to get into like nitty gritty of like, as a producer, everything you can do insurance. So we won't belabor the point, but I think it is important even for no budget productions to be thinking about that as it goes. Well, I had an experience once on a film where the location we needed was a federal park, and we could film there for free. Great, but we needed general liability insurance, which, like, in order for them to sign the waivers for it and stuff. And that was an unexpected cost and it sucked. So it's something you need to think about. It's also a way to save yourself from going over budget when something does go wrong, right? The piece of gear breaks, God forbid someone gets injured, it's the kind of thing that, you know, use your best judgment for the scope and scale of the project, but it's a cost that will hopefully save you from being going into a very dark hole if the worst were to happen to a production. So we just want to highlight it here in the budgeting process, because especially I know we have a number of filmmakers here who just came out of school, and universities, you're often like operating with your university's insurance, but once you're out in the wilderness, you're on your own. And it's really worth talking to someone who's done that before, figure out what the costs are, and build it into your budget. If you're just filming with your friends for like one night, that's one thing, but it will come up sooner or later. So just wanted to flag it.
Yeah, you can only guerrilla style shoot your productions for so long, but yeah, it's a good tool to have, and definitely security and peace of mind. We kind of touched on cash flow a little bit earlier, but partly why we want to make sure, because as you're budgeting, you want to make sure the scale of who you have in each of your, I guess, your calendar year, or however long your production flows. So I've had productions that go sometimes a year, 2 years, months even, depending on what type of project. But the main thing is why you need to know your cash flow is because you're going to actually build your contracts based on that cash flow. So if you don't have money in the bank, you can't guarantee a weekly payroll during production. Or you can, like, especially with the telefilm, we had to send them our shooting schedule and our proof to show that we actually shot that day. Then they release the check, and then but we were in the middle of nowhere. So it's not like we could easily cash the check. So you have to plan a bit. And so then also just getting people to the community, we definitely had to have the hotels, or as I mentioned, I was going to say a train, but the planes, the flights. And so some people also want to get paid up front. So you're also negotiating when people get paid. Some people are more generous and they can say, okay, I can wait till the end. But if you know when you're going to get paid, you can start to gear your contracts towards those days, because there's going to be some days that it gets eaten and then you're waiting for your next check. And so you don't want to be in an awkward position where you guaranteed you're going to pay all these people out and then you don't have it there. Most people understand how that works, but you just want to make sure you understand it, so you're communicating it and when you're going to get paid out and what you need to do to get paid out. Because sometimes you need to actually have, like, say, an assembly cut, and then that would launch the next one. So it could be stages depending on who your funder is. If it's an independent artist grant, they generally will just give you your funds, hold a little bit of, I think it's like 10%, 20%, depending on who the funder is. Sometimes you can get the whole check depending on which one, but most of the time they're going to want their final report. So there is going to be costs that will come out when that final report comes out. So that's partly why we also put fundraising if necessary, because that's unrestricted cash flow. And if you're really good at fundraising and getting support, it's also marketing. Like, people know you're going to make that film, then there's a lot more support for when it comes out. So you'll build in your whole distribution plan for, like, say, Indiegogo. You're going to guarantee a community screening. You're going to have people come out. You're going to offer them t-shirts. Back in the day when DVDs were like the thing, people would get a DVD. Now you might say you get a digital copy or access to something, but however you frame your Indiegogo, there's going to be hard costs. So you're going to have to pay for those t-shirts. So there is a cost associated with the fundraising, but I would say I would rather have people fundraise than dig into their own personal funds as much as possible. Like, I think some people just go to that so easily because we're all generous and we all love the vision. But the reality is you want people to have security, peace of mind with their day-to-day life. Like, for me, I have 2 sons. I don't want them to starve just so I can serve a creative purpose. You know, I want to make sure that I'm feeding my kids at home. So that's why we really emphasize the cash flow and the fundraising and understanding that conversation. So being a single mom actually really made me think a lot about how I didn't quite fit into what a typical producer looked like. So it wasn't just me building up capital and credit and getting the line of financing. It was really my lifestyle in terms of how. So we actually built everything that most of the productions were always built with that in mind, that we were also thinking about our own needs along the way, just to make sure that we were taking care of ourselves so we could take care of the film. So don't overlook yourself is my point, which I think is the next slide even. I think I might have went ahead. Yes, this is where people feel guilty. I find everybody is so noble, they don't want to pay themselves. But honestly, if, like, I was working at the Mackenzie Art Gallery full time and trying to do a feature film, it was really hard. But lucky I had a job at that point that supported me to take 3 weeks off so that I could do that. But then I was also able to make up my time so that I could actually still have my income. But then I was really burnt out. But part of that is making sure that within those times that you're working, you're thinking about that grant. So if it's an independent artist grant, you can actually pay yourself a salary, which covers your general expenses. So some let you pay $1,500 to $2,000. I know Artsport, I think, was at $2,000 at one point. Some are $2,500. So depending on how it looks, or it could be a contract for yourself as a producer, and then you just get a flat fee. So however you frame it, depending on which production, you definitely want to make sure you're not waiting for, I guess, you're not waiting to get rich off your movie. You're actually building it in, and then anything after is a bonus. And then, yeah.
If I can add something to that too, it's at a higher level as well. what happens when you run out of money and you go through a contingency and stuff, it's coming out of your paycheck as the producer. That's like my last film was produced through Sodec in Quebec, and that's the agreement. So it's important that you have some cash flow for yourself as well in a situation like that. It's because yeah, like this is the kind of thing we mean when we say the producer is ultimately the one liable for the production. And yeah, it's really important to factor that in. It's going to be way more work than you ever hope for. But yeah, the more time you have allocated, the better the project's going to be. So yeah, just remember to pay yourself.
Yeah, and then, you know, for those who do offer space or mentorship, time, resources, props, like definitely factor in all the in-kind. So acknowledge it in your expenses, but also make sure you're putting it as a revenue, so your budget balances. And if there's no, I guess, fee, then I always just try and estimate what that would have costed if I hadn't. And then part of that, you also give them credit for that support, and that helps you the next time you do a project, is that you have a better sense of what your production really would cost at full value. Because in one project, you might have everybody contributing, really wanting to see that film. But as you go on, especially depending on who you want to bring in, you definitely want to make sure you're planning to pay people as much as possible. And then for rates, you know, we didn't want to go too hard into rates because it also is going to depend on your film. We can talk about it for questions, but you know, for most of my projects that I would do in an independent artist grant, there's those salary rates that I mentioned that they're acceptable. They definitely have them in the eligible expenses and tell you what your max is for that. But you also want to make sure that we're looking at, for those ones, I would say Carfact is the best. I always go to Carfact. If I have a great budget, I go to Carfax, Saskatchewan. So it'll look a little different than if you're working for someone who's unionized. So through the NFB, I'm unionized. So it goes by my experience level and they pay my union dues. So my rates are much higher than what I would pay myself on an artist grant. So it is going to look different. And then if you're working with ACTRA, we were talking a little bit about how that could look. So sometimes you can get a non-union rate. Oh, right. Next, see, I'm always jumping ahead, but you can definitely, oh, there we go. You know, there is union rates that you can go to. And so sometimes that might even be like, say, for someone shooting, I know we've had people paid up to $700 a day. So if you say times that by a week, your rates are going to go quite high. On a micro budget, we've been able to negotiate with the unions to do reduced rates, so $300 a day, but that's a really reduced scale in that kind of scenario, versus if you're doing an independent artist where you could do the Carfact rate, which could be $350 to $500, depending on a half day or a full day. But I really am a big fan of Carfact. I know some people will do smaller rates. Like I know for ACTRA, some of the rates that I've been paid for narration can be quite low, like 200 is lots for a voiceover. So depending on where you go, you want to take a look. But I know a lot of people like to also make their actors work for exposure. Again, please don't. If you have them, that's great. And if you can, if it's a smaller scale, but for the most part, I think if you think of how many gigs an actor will do and how many days they're actually active. Yeah. And if you do that, then I like to build them into the travel, like make them part of the distribution experience. If you're not able to pay them what you would have liked, you can also negotiate that if there is any profit made out of it, that you can kind of do like a shareholder model and pay it out. So there's different ways to negotiate it. But if you're looking for someone who's an established actor, those rates will get pretty high because they can negotiate with you and they can go above what their ACTRA rates are. So it is important to understand the union rates and the nature of your project. And then, yeah, we kind of talked in about the hiring, the team building, like to me, that's the most important part, is who you're going to work with. You
Well,
want to
and where, because that will also affect your budget at higher levels. When we look at region-specific tax credits, there are hiring incentives, or grants like what Creative Saskatchewan does, right? And that becomes this, that becomes this additional morphing feature of the budget where you budgeted for a certain amount of tax credits in return from hiring crew, but then you get this great cinematographer who's from Manitoba and like they're perfect for the project, but that's going to mean a little bit less of tax credit incentives. And so this is where this is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of larger productions. It's why you see the government of Ontario and government of Quebec at the end of a Hollywood movie with all the VFX names. It's because there's government subsidies there. Or why production's been in Vancouver so often. It's not a huge factor with small productions where we're just shooting in Regina or something, but it quickly becomes a game shifting aspect of the budgeting process once you have larger crews or more expensive productions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that happened with feature film, is that we had to get specialized skills outside of Saskatchewan. And so we weren't able to maximize what the tax credits were because we didn't have as much of the Saskatchewan crew and actors that we had planned in our submitted budget. So those decisions do impact what you'll get back in terms of your final reporting, your last check for each funder. So yeah, it is really super important that you're having these conversations with your director, because honestly, that's where the tension can arise. Is they really love that Manitoba cinematographer, they're essential. So then you make those compromises based on that, which goes to the negotiating and being realistic. So I find, when you hear someone say, oh, I got a $250,000 budget to make a movie, it sounds like a lot, but if you really think about all the roles and expenses that go into a micro budget, it's only as big as minimal of your idea. So if you make a very simple, less locations, you can definitely maximize. And especially if you have a smaller crew, you can definitely do a lot more. But if you really need like special effects, stunt person, like you need the whole shebang, that's going to be eaten up pretty fast. And so, that's important. And because I have done films where, I do it for love, because I love what they're doing and I do things for free. We put feed your people in there. And so part of that is, protecting your cast and crew from not just being starved, but you're helping them feel appreciated as part of the larger circle. So I was actually telling Mattias that I was playing a mental health or mental patient in Weyburn. I wasn't getting paid. They gave me a ride there, but then they didn't factor any food. And I was a student at the time. So I basically starved that whole day because they didn't have craft services. And even if they had a granola bar, I could have survived. But the assumption was that if I'm going there, they're probably gonna have at least some level of craft services. But that day was a very long day. So if you are getting people to do that, just make sure you're building in those hospitality costs, whatever you call it. But, I think it's really important that you take care of them while they're working for you. So.
Yeah, I realize our like subtextual mandate here is we're trying to make you into good producers, and because it's all about relationships, and like people will remember when you made them pay for their own pizza on location 5 hours from home. They will remember when they had to pay for their own gas. People remember, and if for that reason alone it's important, but it's just super important that you absorb the costs.
Yeah, and a lot of the things we're sharing is, like, as I said, we learn through hardship. So we definitely didn't walk in knowing all these tips and tricks. It was actually through different productions that some of these lessons came, and sometimes they came pretty hard, and sometimes, you know, they were just simple and you were able to adapt. But definitely the producer is relational. Like, it's really important. It's not just sitting there looking at your budget and your books. You really are the one who is setting the tone and the foundation for the whole entire production, especially if you go into a community. You're the one who's meeting the businesses, you're getting to know people, you're welcoming people in. If you have a disgruntled crew person, you're managing that, mediating that is the word I was trying to find, but you're also doing a lot of that important work. So it is a really important role. It is all connected with your budget. So that's why I always say it's good to over budget in a lot of areas, but not too much, because I sat on juries and people do notice if you over budget to an extreme, they'll ask questions. But definitely if you're padding, that you plan for just a little bit more, because flights are going to change. If you are a last minute booker, it's going to be a lot different than if you're like ahead of the game booking 6 months ahead. So that's why I like to make travel a variable. Definitely hospitality, I build in quite a bit, because then you can always scale it. But as long as you're planning for that, I always talk to who I'm going to bring in for crew building as much as I can, so I understand where their rates are right away. But you can definitely negotiate along the way. And yeah, I think those are kind of the main things, but definitely get to know the union. And you can always work around, but you have to negotiate. Like, I think it was Mike Burns who was ACTRA. I don't know who's doing that now, but we were able to get low rates on one of the productions I did as well. But it did have to have like a, what did you call it? An informal negotiation where you were just talking to them, sharing the nature of it, but it was important to do it.
Yeah, it's like, that's it. Is everyone world, you know, most of us are doing this because we love it, especially if you're working on your friends' micro budget productions. But to like understand the value of the work people are contributing is yeah, it's really important, so you can have those discussions, because the truth is we are working with limited resources. There aren't oodles of opportunities all the time, and sometimes there needs to be a compromise somewhere. So actually understanding the full value is really important, so you can have a healthy conversation. We want to get some questions, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit faster. Janine's already talked a little bit about the different funders, but was there anything else you wanted to add, Janine, about like what people should be thinking about?
Well, just more, I'm going to put in the chat here, and then we'll also get them to send it out. I'm just going to put some different links into the chat. Some of them show up as links, but different considerations in terms of where you can look for funding and each of the scale. So we talked a little bit about, actually the film pool also has some funds that can be accessed. They have equipment, so I made sure as our hosts that we acknowledge that they do have some resources. So, you know, getting a membership can have multiple values. You can also apply space, equipment. So then I also highlighted, I see that we do have Jolie here who's Indigenous. So Esperanza. So there's the Indigenous Screen Office. I like to highlight them because they're doing some amazing work, and they funded quite a bit of people last year. And so I've been able to support their process a little bit. And so they've been doing, they've been really trying to emphasize development a lot more. So they're a little lenient on the development side, as long as you have like a good scale, but they'll look at who you're working with. So I think they're really important to highlight because they're really setting some really wonderful tones. I put Canada Council, I think for artists, that's a great one to go
James,
to.
you had a question here. Yes, right.
I'm just trying to drop this down. It says creative, and then it's just cut off on the screen.
Oh, it's our pals at Creative Saskatchewan.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure there was another. Sorry.
Yes, no, please go on, Jane.
Oh yeah. So then there's Canada Council, which would be partly when I say look at the independent, I also will caution that it's going to show up on your taxes. So you'll definitely want to keep all your contracts of people you're paying out, because you don't want to have to absorb that in your end of the year. I made that mistake before. So I learned, but that is actually you producing, and it goes straight to you. So you can create a separate account in your bank account to keep them separated, because you do want to be careful with those ones. But they're good for the experimentation. They're definitely good at advancing your art form. They have a little bit more flexibility, and they have a wider range of like, this is what I'm hoping to do and where you want to be. So I like those for when I'm trying to just advance my art form. And then I would say for Creative Sask and actually for Telefilm, they really want to see your roadmap. So they want to know you considered as much as possible, but Telefilm is also pretty good for development. So actually a lot of funders are now starting to recommend that you focus a lot on your development, and they allocate money for that and for script writing as well to really hone in on that. So I really support that, because if you have a bad development or a fast development, that's where you end up eating your contingency. So the more you do your planning, the better you are when you're in the thick of shooting. And then I also put the National Film Board. We can also get this sent out so that you guys can also get these links, because some of them didn't show up as links. But they have that 50-50 program. So there's some shared ownership. And then the Canada Media Fund does have some things on there, but they also fund like Telefilm and other places, but they're important to note as well. And so these are just ones that I highlighted. They're definitely not all that's out there, but those are the ones that I have worked with and understand and recommend that people get to know a little bit more. But as I noted, Telefilm, Creative Saskatchewan, they're going to want you to incorporate, which actually separates your taxes at the end of each year. You'll just have to do 2 taxes. You'll have to do one for your company and then one for yourself. And then you acknowledge what you're paying yourself from that company. So they're kind of hand in hand, but you definitely want to keep those ones separated. So that's why we really wanted to help understand who you're actually getting, the nature of it. Because if it's something you're just going to do one time, so you can just make an incorporated body for one project and shut it down after it's over. I've done those, but you can also do a company that you can keep producing with, which will end up being your parent company. And that'll allow you to continuously access these other funding bodies. And then I just always encourage, I love Sask Arts Board. I think they're doing such amazing work, and same with Canada Council. They can be competitive, but they're definitely good places to go to. They have emerging and different types of funding. So they're trying to open it up so that it's easier to get your projects funded.
Yeah, the one detail I would add is for people who do incorporate with the producer, Canada Council doesn't like that. It's something that going back to the early slides about deciding where your project wants to go, if you're at that point, this is a question I had to answer for myself, it may disqualify you from those certain funds. Similarly with, unfortunately, the funding situation with Sask Arts is if you qualify for other commercial funds, like for Creative Saskatchewan, that may disqualify you for Sask Arts. So they're important questions at the beginning and important questions as you get further in your fundraising process and the path becomes clearer.
Yeah, and you can definitely, like, after you do your project and you wrap up your grant, it's not that you can't ever share out your video, say if a distributor picks it up, you can still do further sharing, but you have to keep them really separate. So you wouldn't want to put in there that this is going to be CBC broadcasted. You would build it in as an independent format. So they will have eligible and ineligible expenses. So that one you might really build in your community engagement and any kind of festival circuit stuff. But definitely, if you're gearing towards the broadcast, you're going to want to look at Telefilm, or you're going to want to look at Creative Sask, because that's what they're going to want to see is your broadcast plan. And so sometimes that's not in place. Sometimes you're just building it as you go along. And sometimes you need to think about multiple broadcasters. So that's a whole other workshop you could spend hours on, is broadcasting first window, second window, how long can you have multiple? Can you go to like Apple TV, Netflix? So there's so many more options now that we're in a digital world, more so than we did before. Like before, I find it was pretty limited to what's on cable, but now there's different formats. But you do have to look at each of them because you can get disqualified from one to another. So if you just want to throw your video on the YouTube, then you might disqualify yourself from having a world premiere screening. So, but if you want to go straight to online, there's also funding for that. But I eventually like to put everything online and have a home because I feel like that's basically how I like to operate, is having everything accessible at the end of the day. But that's not for everybody. So if you're distribution minded, then go down that path.
We're sharing a lot of information too, but all of these funders are there to answer your questions. So if there ever is a point where you're like, wait a sec, like I'm reading the fine print and it says this, they're there to answer those questions, and they understand the programs, and you're guaranteed to not be the first person to ask. So never be afraid to reach out to them.
Oh yeah, I would say build a relationship with your representatives for each of the funding, because they'll also review your grant or your application, and they'll flag things for you to take back and to consider. And then don't be scared of the notes. If you hear a no, you can ask them what notes what you could have done. And sometimes they'll take those notes for you, because I know we do that on some of the jury processes. And so we mindfully want to help people apply again and do better. And then, yeah, I think for the most part, I think people do want to see you get funded. The only thing is if it's highly competitive or your application narrative doesn't match your budget. That's the big thing I've seen people hear no to, is that they just didn't allocate enough funding for ideas that they put there. So just to know that that lens is what they're looking for in terms of who they want to fund and not fund.
Yeah, that's it. Because the jury members are us, right? You know, like they're other people in the industry, in the arts world, the people who have made things, and they know how much things cost. So if you don't know how much something costs and you budget for it in a weird way, it's gonna give the impression that maybe you don't know what you're doing. And so but you're all at this workshop, so that's not going to be a problem. Janine, we're running a little bit behind and we still want to have time for questions. Is there anything you wanted to add about some of our last points?
No, I think we kind of covered it. I mean, the doc versus fiction, I mean, each of the grants are gonna, some will do both. Telefilm will do both. They'll do long form documentaries. You have flexibility with the Arts Board and Canada Council, whether it's documentary or fiction. Telefilm's highly narrative, but they'll still do documentary as well. And NFB is just documentary, even though they do some animation and some kind of short narratives if it's reflecting that. But yeah, I mean, if those I see a little note, they'll send it out. I would just take a look at each of those links and then ask yourself where your project fits in and try. So, I mean, even if it's a small production, I say just try. The experience to write a grant and to do a budget is actually valuable. So I've heard no more times than I've heard yes, and now I hear a lot more yes. So, but I'll still hear no. It's going to happen. But yeah, that's all I'd like to add about that. And yeah, we should definitely, we thought we thought this will take an hour just to talk about this. So yeah, we definitely have a lot more to say than we thought we did.
Thank you so much, everyone. And we're really eager to hear your questions or any specifics about your projects. Like if there's something that's been a lingering question about a past project, something you're applying for now, or just like a project you're trying to scope out, we're here for it, as well as any other questions you have about the budget process.